Now we're in COVID. Anything we've done or not done up until this point is almost irrelevant. Any customer journey planning, any customer experience we were trying to create is now dead. Forget about that. What do we do right now? So we're in lockdown. What should we do first? The first thing is, if you're a retailer and you're an essential retailer, your prime function, your prime directive, keep those shelves full, keep those stores open. If you're a non-essential retailer, it's like get your click and collect up and working, get your home delivery network up and running at scale. And I think that we found very quickly that some organizations, despite them maybe saying you can buy from us online, when there was a huge volume being pointed at them, they just crumpled under the weight of it all. But the concept was just do it, get it done. Don't focus on anything, don't focus on any great strategy or anything, just get the shelves full, get the click and collect working and support the customers.
Welcome and thank you for joining me today. My name is Gary Newberry. I'm a senior executive on call helping businesses in the make, move, sell flow of consumer goods and services. My purpose is to inspire business leaders, particularly those within the consumer products and retailing space, to think big, be bold, scale, adapt and win, one epic supply chain transformation at a time. There's additional content available through my website, RetailAID.ca, or on my YouTube channel, RetailAID. Be sure to check it out. As the business world faces much volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity, organizations need to be tapping into resources with an inside edge on transitioning their teams to be agile, innovative and digital, with thought leaders, experts and senior executives who have mastery of operational turnarounds and strategic transformations to help reorientate their enterprises. There's great material to get through here, so let's get started.
Thank you so much for joining us for Gary Newberry presentation part 2. So let's get started.
Thanks, Miriam. Welcome, everybody. For those people who have made it for the second trip, welcome back. Hopefully that you've got some great value from the first one. We've got a huge amount of material to get through, so I'm going to skate over quite a lot of it towards the back end. But for those people who weren't here for the first time, I'm just going to go through the slides that we covered off and then get going into some of the stuff we're going to cover off today. We talked about the supply chain disruptors, which I'm going to touch on quickly, the consumer behaviors, which are starting to impact on individual consumer journeys. And then we're going to start in earnest on the Canadian retailing, and I'm going to give a very broad history of Canadian retailing and what the next steps are to Reinvention. I'm going to talk very broadly again about retail supply chain design challenges, because each company will have its own journey as it works through COVID and the future. And if we have time towards the end, some of the personal keys for success for us as supply chain leaders. If we're not leaders yet, we will become leaders. And just to share some of the views I've come to, reflecting on my career and also in the context of what we experienced through COVID-19. We touched on COVID-19, the fifth of 5 epidemics or pandemics in the last 20 years. We shouldn't have been surprised, but we were, because the surprise moment was how government intervened. We talked about the demand shock generated by 3% panic buying and 97% of people extending their range and also the frequency of which they went shopping, and the supply shock, which was all about making sure marine transportation was in the right place, and that was affected by blank sailings, and containers were in the right place, and that was because the blank sailings, we didn't get the containers to the Far East enough time. Far East was closed down, it suddenly got back up and running, and then retailers, especially in apparels, started to cancel orders left, right and centre, and it caused massive disruption. I also talked and put forward a case that there was no bullwhip effect during the early stages of the closure. But what actually happened was a first steps towards collaboration between major retailers and key suppliers. I talked about some of the fragility as we entered into the lockdown, about how fragile us as a society in Canada were. I mean, one of the big headlines of this was nearly 50% of us as consumers, as individuals, were only $200 away from bankruptcy. We've been living in a world of living paycheck to paycheck, and it didn't take very much for us to start to have a bit of a wobble and fall into some fairly precarious financial situations. We talked about 5 consumer influences, which I see as being instrumental during this period as to how this will shape and how the values of how we've experienced this period of time will influence our buying behavior, including isolation. Sometimes it's not so isolated because we've got a small family of children running around at the house while we're trying to work remotely. Financial capacity, I just touched on that in the previous slide. COVID-19 direct and indirect exposure. Prospect of returning to work, what work will look like in the future, whether or not we will, majority of us or some of us will continue to remote working. And also the one that doesn't often get talked so easily about is a sense of abundance being challenged. And there's some opportunities arising from this period. I think the one that probably interests us the most as logisticians is like the movement from store-based sales to more online sales, and some of the implications of that we'll cover off later in this presentation. We broke there, and I felt like I'd been talking for about half an hour, and the rest of the time was spent with some really good quality, challenging, forthright questions as people try to share some of their thoughts and concerns about what the future of supply chains looking like right now and in the future. And we had some really top level engagement during that 30 minutes. So I'm going to kick off now with what I call the retail concept life cycle, or it sometimes gets abridged to retail life cycle. I put this up there because it helps to explain the next bit. I think we all know the product life cycle, which has this bell-shaped type of curve where a new product is introduced to the market, lots of early adapters grab it, and they tell their friends, and through word of mouth, it gathers a pace for a growth stage. And as it hits maturity, if you're the company, you're in the most cash generative state to be in. It's when it's reached saturation or maturity. So you've got lots of buyers for your product, ideally good margins. It could be better than this, but at some point it does go down the decline curve. And what companies have done over a relatively long period of time is just cut costs to keep the net cash flow broadly the same. And so that's a product life cycle. The retail concept life cycle isn't much different to that. It still follows that same semi-bell-shaped format. You can actually be in the decline stage as a retailer for quite a considerable period of time. And when I talk about retail concept, I'm talking about the format of a store. Is it a big box, a small box, a middle-sized box? What's the kind of categories you have in a store? What's the kind of look and feel of a store? What's the price positioning for your product range? All those kind of things form a retail concept. At the point where we tip out of maturity, it's a real trigger to reinvent. We have to reinvent our retail concept. We say, if we're, say, somebody like Canadian Tire, a company that's been, I think, about 95 years now in running, broadly the same format, generally speaking, a big box format, multiple categories, reasonably deep in each. We know it's a franchise model, so things are perhaps a little bit more difficult than you might be if they're all corporate stores. But there's a trigger to reinvent, because I'm sure that they're all finding themselves either as individual franchises and or overall corporate brand, sort of hitting that decline stage. And the only thing they can think about now is, how do we stop costs? How do we cut costs? How do we reduce our inventory to allow us to keep generating cash? So very broad history of Canadian retailing. We came out of World War II. We had the general store and it was dispositioned nationally. Then we saw 2 things arise from this. One was the department store, which was a one-stop shop for mostly household goods. Your clothes, your appliances, your furniture, other fittings and around your house, the kind of things that, maybe some gardening equipment in there as well. It became the place you would go to, buy stuff, load it into your car, drive it home, and job done. But alongside that was the rise of the mall, where lots of general stores converted into more category specialists, but they were fragmented across Canada. And so the MAL gave an opportunity to be more guaranteed of traffic. These organizations either had a choice of going to the MAL, to be positioned in the MAL, or in what we call power parks, a group of freestanding stores which represented a collection of category specialists. So, something like Michael's would be a great category specialist. So the thing for me is that department store as a format, strong in the 50s, 60s, maybe even 70s, and to an extent 80s, but at the point where it found its own retail concept was starting to head toward decline, and it's been in long-term decline. If you look at Sears Canada, for those people who were here back in 2016, 2017, when it became bankrupt, and HBC to an extent now, these formats have been in long-term decline. But unwittingly, guess where we find most of our department stores? They're either in the power parks as a freestanding store, and or they're actually in the MAL. And the MAL was a direct competitor to the department store. If we think about it, the department store had a wide range of different brands, sometimes own labels, sometimes national brands, looking across different categories. But literally outside their front doors was their more specialized, more focused category specialist competitors. So I would argue, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you reinvent your brand back in the 70s, 80s, maybe early 90s, rather than go and sit with the lion pit? But that's what they did. So part of this emphasis was about following a strategy of growing sales. So how do retailers grow sales? They scale with what we call a go large strategy. So they have larger stores, we have more of them, and we put more stuff in them. So purely in pursuit of sales. And over time, the role of marketing has moved from trying to find markets, trying to segment our markets, find a format which is appropriate to that marketplace, and then creating competitive advantage and making obviously a sustainable profit. But we kind of put that aside. We put marketing down over here into the marketing comms department and said, look, run our flyer, just make sure the flyer goes out every week, and you're doing a good job. And we're going to go for mass market appeal. So basically any customer would come into our store, and as long as they buy something, we're happy. We don't really mind what kind of demographic they are, and is there a trend here? It's just like, come into our store, buy stuff. And if you want to do some impulse shopping at the same time, great. The difficulty with a go large strategy is that as you scale a proposition, you hit a point of diminishing returns. If you're wedded to making more stores work, or heading down a path of creating more stores, you kind of have to think, well, okay, how do I cut my costs? Because if I'm hitting diminishing returns, my margins are going to be affected. So I start finding creative ways to cut costs, not necessarily engineered ways of cutting costs, just creative ways. I have less floor staff. I start pushing stock out to the supplier, getting them to take more of a risk. And finally, I look for markets, supply markets outside my domestic borders, or even my continent. I go to the Far East. Now, some bright idea would say, oh yeah, I can get my stuff for 10% of the cost that it takes to make it domestically. So I, as a national chain, will go to China, and of course, all my competitors follow me. So I'm no better off. The only thing I start to try to work on, the only one of the 4 Ps I can work on now is price. And that's led us down a path which has been to have less cash in the business to look at reinvention. So that's ended up in situations where most retailers have really not had a good time of trying to digitize the whole operation, particularly the supply chain. Because they haven't digitized their operation, they've not been able to do some detailed, deep personalization, except throwing out some emails and hoping that it's hitting the right target somehow. And because of that, despite all the lip service around customer centricity, we're not getting anywhere near customer centricity. So when I think about the 2010s, the time from when the Great Recession to COVID, I think many retailers were just chasing shiny nickels. They're just thinking technology was the only way forward. Let's get some AI that will fix our problems, without actually fixing the real problems, which were normally process driven. And there was no roadmap to success. It was just like the next sales guy would come in with a glossy binder and say, look, we could, using this technology, you could have all this. It would be brilliant. Some people would buy into that, get their IT people working on this technology, and nothing much would change, and it would be a very poor ROI. So we're in COVID. And this is rather prescriptive. This was developed during March. Now we're in COVID. Anything we've done or not done up until this point is almost irrelevant. Any customer journey planning, any customer experience we were trying to create is now dead. Forget about that. What do we do right now? So we're in lockdown. What should we do first? The first thing is, if you're a retailer and you're an essential retailer, your prime function, your prime directive, keep those shelves full, keep those stores open. If you're a non-essential retailer, it's like, get your click and collect up and working, get your home delivery network up and running at scale. And I think that we found very quickly that some organizations, despite them maybe saying we can buy from us online, when there was a huge volume being pointed at them, they just crumpled under the weight of it all. But the concept was just do it, get it done. Don't focus on anything, don't focus on any great strategy or anything. Just get the shelves full, get the click and collect working, and support the customers. Alongside that, part of the business should have really broken out and said, look, we've got this technology, we've got this process, we've got our organizational structure, we've got our ways of working here, our culture. How do we get ready for consumers that are going to fundamentally change their ways of seeing us as a solution to some of the problems they may have? We don't know how all this is going to unravel. We're not overly brilliant at tracking changes in demography, activism, environmental, a whole range of things, the smartphone, etc. Kind of almost passed us by as we went for the appeal of mass markets. So we are where we are. We're not going to buy new technology. We've got technology. How can we reconfigure this to develop new capabilities which we can adapt as we become more aware of how our target consumers are changing, how their values are changing, and how we sit within their consideration set as a viable solution for the kind of problems that they need to be solved. So the third stage is to adapt those new capabilities and literally let go of what got us through that first stage of just do it. Now, one of the things that this is fairly retail centric, and I kind of alluded to some of the challenges that retailers have in terms of their organizational structure for many, many years, in fact, many, many decades, nearly 10 of them. Merchandising and stores have always been like the kingpin in retailing, and everything else is like periphery, even to the extent that marketing, which is normally at the top of the organization, and this isn't just retailing, if you look at any business, manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, retailing, call it what like, you always should see a clear position that marketing is at the top of the organization. It is the one that guides, it's a function that guides us towards profitable markets. That hasn't really happened in a meaningful way across retailing. So one of the things that should have emerged from this transformational stage is for marketing to reposition itself to lead the organization out of COVID and into the future by identifying market segments and relevant proposition, which is part of the reinvention process. And it is its responsibility to create and implement a continuous reinvention process, to have all the devices and measurement systems to say, where are we on that retail concept life cycle? And do we need to now think about a new concept that we need to develop? I think in the center of the organization, or in the middle part, is merchandising and the integrated sales channel, so that online, offline being integrated, not as separate, and merchandising pulling that together, that strand together rather than seeing them as two two separate silos, and their job is to do the assortment planning, which is to work out what we need in terms of the kind of products and how we're going to attract consumers into our environment, either online or offline, and how do we sell them when they've actually come onto the website or gone into the store. And that means, by inference, and this is where I've come from, is that all other throughput operations are supply chain. Now, if you go into any retailer, and there are all themes around this, you sometimes find supply chain is part of merchandising, sometimes it's over here, sometimes there's a logistics function on its own, it does the transport warehousing and sometimes the inventory management, and there's no clear definition of where the supply chain starts and finishes. Everybody's responsible for everything, and therefore, as a result of that, sometimes not everything gets done. But I see much more clarity than that required in the future of retailing. Things like demand planning, sourcing, allocation or replenishment, store replenishment, or micro-fulfillment replenishment, or other versions of how we handle online. So what I've been advocating for quite some time is POC is point of convenience availability. So point of convenience can be on the shelf, it can be within the confines of click and collect, whether or not that's in-store or curbside, or it can be to a point of convenience, either on a customer's journey to somewhere, like to fuel garage, to a local shopper's drug mart as a place to pick up, to a train station, or to their home. But having high point of convenience availability is key to consumer value. Until the consumer can get it into their hand, they can't consume it, and it's in the process of consuming they drive value. But if they can both have the merchandising defining the kind of products or services that help a consumer develop a solution to their problem they've got, and if a logistics supply chain can deliver that in a consistent way, this is a way of driving loyalty. And loyalty is one of the big competitive forces or competitive advantages that a retailer has at its advantage when it coordinates those two basic functions. And just to finish off this slide, things like HR, IT, estates and finance, and they all rise in different levels of importance within retailing. Sometimes some retailers, like HBC currently, is a very estates-driven retailer because the guy who's now running it is an estates guy. And sometimes you get tech people sitting on top of retailers, and so it becomes much more tech-orientated. So these functions must support the three levels within the organization I've described, rather than trying to force their agenda through. So HR supports all the aspects about recruiting and cultural development. Estates, making sure we've got the right fleet size and we've got enough facilities, etc., not being the core reason why we exist. I've put a slide in here for any questions. Andrew's written something. As more major grocery retailers create their own online shopping and delivery platforms, could we possibly see a reduced size and availability of the regular grocery stores, and how will this affect the street level mom-up grocery stores in the next 6 months? Gosh, that's a huge question to answer. I'm going to make a quick attempt at that because I've got... Let me just go on to the next slide, and we'll just pause at the end of the next slide to allow anybody to gather their thoughts. If you want to clarify anything or ask any questions, please type out your question. Now, and I think that I'm going to attempt to, by asking the question, does online fulfillment pay? And under Betteridge's law of all newspaper headlines, if it ends with a question mark, 95% of it times the answer is no. I think there's a whole range of things wrong with how we think about online, especially how it's grown within the retailing environment. Often, as I mentioned earlier on, retailing has always been about merchandising in stores, and I've suggested in the future world that they sit in the middle of the organization, marketing on top. They're doing the execution of identifying stuff to be sold or services to be sold, and how they're going to be sold, how stuff is going to, how consumers are going to be attracted, and everything else is a supply chain. The trouble is how it's actually grown. The online has often been an adjunct to the mainstay of a business, a store, and it's particularly prevalent in Canada. Just as a comparison, pre-COVID, 40% of retail traffic was online in the UK. I haven't got an up-to-date figure in China. I think it's even higher than that. And that's certainly where all the growth in e-commerce really is, and all the new technology and new ways of thinking is China. So you've got UK and probably to an extent Germany in sort of level peggings. South of the border, it's somewhere between 10 and 15% of total retail. And in Canada, it hasn't reached 5% up until pre-COVID. It's moved forward now because, basically if you can't go to the store and they've got a website, you order on webs. So we've seen a big spike in the propensity of people to actually engage in online. The issue for me here is how we actually track the financials of supporting an online business. In the financials, we kind of think, well, we start tracking it from a point where we've got it to a single so we can actually ship it. So maybe that's at store level. So the cost of it has got itself to the store through the store network cost system. And now if we're doing a store-based picking approach to fulfill click and collect or home delivery, we're going to measure just the people involved if the actual selection process, maybe putting in bags or packing into boxes and handing it over to either the customer or a carrier. That's not the whole picture. And I think that Target started to kind of work this out over the last quarter. They said our e-commerce sales have gone up by 141%. I'd have been fine if they said that they've gone up by 1.5 times. It's fine with me. But they also said the subtext of this was that we've started to encounter costing problems which we didn't anticipate. And what they, I think, really mean by that is that we didn't really understand the whole cost of the e-commerce supply chain end to end. We took it from the fact that we were doing quite a lot of online fulfillment was actually in store. So all the costs of getting it there was absorbed by the store. And we're really interested in this piece where we're actually picking all the way out to the customer onto a shipped platform or click and collect. There's some major glitches in the financial tracking. One of the reasons why e-commerce doesn't pay is when we scale it, suddenly a lot of other costs come out which we didn't anticipate. Another aspect is high customer acquisition costs, and if you read in the articles about online, you'll see CAC, that means customer acquisition costs, which is all the SEO, the ad spending, whatever it might be, that builds up to trying to attract a customer to come onto your website or into your mobile app and place an order, versus the long-term value of that customer. And that's the discounted cash flow of the margin over a period of time, say 7, 8, 10 years. Now, if you're Wayfair, and if you look at their accounts, I think in the last year they sold 9 billion and they spent 10 billion. And that difference between those two was primarily the ad spending. They had to spend so much to attract a customer to buy on their site. And the worst thing about their business model is, if it's furniture, how often, you buy a 3-piece suite for your living rooms. What's the likelihood you're going to nip out in a couple of months' time and buy a replacement for that? It's very unlikely. The average age of a 3-piece suite might be over 10 years. So you've attracted the customer, you've had to spend a fortune on TV advertising, social media advertising, ad spending, you name it. They're spending, everyone's pretty familiar with Wayfair in terms of the brand image. But the cycle time for you to get the next major order, not just a couple of cushions or something, but like the bed, the 3-piece suite, whatever, is a very long cycle. So this equation must be in balance. The cost of actually acquiring a customer must be so much smaller than the long-term value. Otherwise, you kind of ask a question. It's not rational to spend so much money up front to acquire a customer, only to see that they buy once and then move on to somewhere else like Amazon or Walmart. There's also aspects around the kind of the actual physical last mile between, do you go on demand or do you go scheduled? Well, I read a report very recently by Mike Medlin who's the CEO of Empire, which has Sobeys. So it just opened up I think about 3 or 4 months ago for internal testing, their Voila service. And he actually said, I can pick your shop and get it to you in an hour, which is on demand. It doesn't say like, I'm coming to you on Wednesday, get your order on Monday kind of thing. So for grocery business, which has a very low margin, he's going full speed on demand. So he's going to have lots of small Voila trucks all over GTA until they run out of trucks, because they will run out of physical capacity. I think Sobeys are going to be pushed to move towards a scheduled service. So one of the things that Amazon have educated us to expect is reasonably fast service. When I do my shopping on Amazon, I know that as long as I order broadly the right kind of stuff, it's on my doorstep at 3 o'clock tomorrow. And as long as I organize my buy-in, I think, okay, yeah, what do I need tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow evening? I need to buy it now so it can be there at 3 o'clock. So we're in this world of speed, when actually I think if Amazon said, well, I'll bring it to you tomorrow, but it could be 9 o'clock, it could be 12 o'clock, it could be 3 o'clock, it could be 8 o'clock at night. Is that all right? But it is next day. I think that we'd say, well, actually, I'd rather have it on 2 days. I want it at 9 o'clock in the morning. I want you to be able to produce that level of consistency, so I can step back and say, when do I need to make my order? When we go online, there's an awful tendency from retailers and probably manufacturers as well to proliferate the SKUs online, because if we believe that we've done enough through the go large strategy of building enough stores, bigger stores, put more stuff in there, we've come to a constraint. But we've got online. We can proliferate SKUs online. The scary thing that retailers don't always think, they think they're building sales, but they actually have to build margin. And what often is the case is, as they proliferate their SKUs, they find consumers will come in and pick off the lower margin products and get them delivered. That's exactly the opposite of what they had in mind. We've got to start looking at things from a consumer point of view, not from a retail-centric point of view. So things like extended aisles were almost, very much a retail construct. And that was probably fed by consultants saying, well, I tell you what, if you go online, if you've got 10,000 lines in your store, you can get 20,000 on top of that. But then you've got, not only have you got SKU proliferation, but when the consumer comes in, they say, oh, can I have one of these, one of those, one of those? And you've only got, say, one in a store, and you've got 2 of those items in the warehouse. So you go, yes, we'll take your order, but we end up with 2 deliveries. And the argument is, it's all right, because we're paying for that to get to the customer. And I'd argue that the customer only wants 1 delivery. It doesn't matter who's paying for it. They believe they're paying for it. And if you're giving them 2 deliveries, you're saying, well, who's paying for that overall? If I only ordered 1 thing and you got it to me in one go, is there too much money in this job? So the SKU proliferation adds in supply chain complexity. There's a risk of what we call splits. It also will, as you proliferate your range online, you will start to see consumers picking off the cheaper items, the ones with the lower margins. And the last point is free delivery and hassle-free returns. It begs the question, who's eating my lunch? Because the traditional model has been that you come in as a consumer, you've driven to the store, you do all your buy-in, you do the tilling up, you take it out to your car, you open up the trunk, and you put your stuff in and you do your own last mile. And all of a sudden the retailer is saying, no sweat, we can do all that for free. Don't worry, just shop with us, shop online with us. And there's no such a thing as a free delivery. So does online fulfillment pay? Almost certainly not, especially when you haven't approached this with a logistics mindset and one geared on margin. So I'll just stop the point there. I'm going to pick up some questions. Miriam, do you want to invite some people to chip in so we can have a quick interaction?
Yes, of course. I'm going to try to unmute if Sagar can speak directly. So I believe the question was, do you think retail real estate will be thing or past with more innovation online model coming along?
Yeah, I think I might have touched on this last time, but I think there's always going to be a place for a store. It's a sense of community. It's a sense of a place where you can get inspired, get connected with the brand, meet other fellow shoppers who love the brand, etc. The store as a place where you buy staples will become a thing of the past. You will not go to the grocer to buy your Tide and tins of beans and stuff. That should all be done through online. And in fact, the retailer's job is to place their product on your portal, however it's going to be organized, in a way that just meets your week to week, month to month requirements. But the store is going to be, I hate to say this because the term often gets misconstrued, but very much like an experience center. It's where you connect with the brand. So online has to grow a long way still to be able to take all the staples out of stores, out of a Canadian Tire, out of Home Depot, out of Sobeys, Loblaws, you name it, out of Walmart, and get that done through a delivery model. So you only come to a store to connect with the store and the brand. I think that means the stores are going to progressively become smaller and there may be less of them, but the store is not going to go away. It has collections of stores have become, for a long time, for hundreds of years, have always been a community. So if you look at the Mall, you've got a selection of stores. You often have entertainment in there. You've got a food court, and now through mixed development, you've got housing and working conditions. But that's, I have some views about that being a bit lazy thinking. But I think the store is not going to go away. Its purpose will fundamentally change, and it's how quickly that will happen. Will it happen in our lifetime? I think absolutely yes. Will it happen in the next few years? I'm crossing my fingers and saying it must do.
Okay. I think we had another question from Peter, and Peter should be able to speak.
Hi, Gary. Thanks, Mary. Hi. Yeah, so I had a couple questions here. You mentioned earlier on that reinvention. So I was thinking, in regards to building a product to match a certain price or price profile, what do you think that retailers are going to be able to do in regards to pushing down those cost margins in a post-COVID economy? For instance, so many people have lost incomes and stuff like that. Like, how do you think it's going to go down? I have a couple more here too. So there's that. Plus, just to follow up on your last comment there about stores closing. I know Microsoft is just closed, so I'm thinking, one step further is maybe Procter & Gamble or Microsoft, may just take on the entire retail space themselves and have mobile platforms where you can go and interact with their products, and they can do demonstrations, things like that, and just bypass the store networks and just sell direct.
Yeah, it would probably take me many hours to unpack all the stuff that you've said, but and thank you for the question. Great kind of selection of things there. But I think there's going to be a massive flight to value right now. And when I go into, and I'll be a bit parochial here, when I go into my local Canadian Tire, they're still running the same old promotions they've been running forever. I think that there'll be a point where that doesn't work anymore for that retailer, and the apparel retailers are going to be opening, and they've got 3 months of stock in their stores, and from out of season, what do? So they've got to do some big markdowns, or they've got either they have been thinking about reinvention, in which case they have to clear that stock out, give it to charity, send it to Africa, wherever, just clear it out. Don't think about, we've got to keep my margins and all that lot and do some markdown programs. They've got to clear it out and bring in new staff to preserve the pricing point. But that would be because they've gone through a process. I think that most apparel stores just sling open the doors, invite people in, look, 80% off, can we tempt you? And people go, well, actually, it's the height of summer and it's not going to happen because I'm not buying spring stuff. In terms of your wider point about CPGs going direct. It's always been their intention for CPGs to find a way of owning the relationship. When they go for a retailer, the retailer's owning so many relationships, it can't really focus on any particular one. It may spend a bit more time promoting a particular national brand with some support from the CPG. And the CPGs have always said, how can I access Canadian residentials directly? Because I get my ideas from their use. They tell me stuff that is filtered out by retailers. So what are the big challenges for Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Kraft, all the major manufacturers? It's scale. They can't scale. They haven't got the scale to go direct. So they have to find a way of collaborating. And certainly in the UK about 15 years ago, Unilever and Procter & Gamble did collaborate on a trial to see how it might work, how they could, for want of a better way, cut out the middleman, which is a retailer. And it was going swimmingly well until somebody said, do you know what? Unilever running promotion on whatever it was. Did you know that? To Procter & Gamble. Or the other way around. And the whole thing fell apart very quickly because they will still be thinking about their own business. They want to collaborate on infrastructure, but at the end of the day, they're still wanting to win at the residential address. So we've still got a long way to mature before we can have those proper discussions. But the whole thing about the e-commerce is, does it scale? What is the critical mass? Is it so high? And does the infrastructure need to be so installed already? Does there need to be? And this is one of the challenges when I came to Canada. So because I come from a sort of two-man home delivery kind of background, and I said, "Where's the national players?" There aren't any. There's people who appear to be national, but they all outsource it to local owner-operators and smaller businesses. So there's no real national platform for in-home deliveries. I'm hoping that COVID is accelerating everybody's thoughts about how do CPGs go direct, or do they work with retailers in a much different way, rather than this kind of constant battle of price and you've got to give me some support for that listings and all this kind of stuff. Can we find a way out of this that the CPG and the retailer and the customer all benefit from a new form of relationship? I've turned on this slide here because your question prompted me to rush straight to the bottom of this slide, that what role do CPGs play in a post-COVID world? Can they go direct? Have they got the scale to do that? What has to happen for them to be able to go direct? And if they can't go direct, how can they change that relationship they have had for decades with retailers? All right, it's probably improved over a long period of time, but not so it's not a leapfrog into this new world. If we got some time, I'll come back to this, but I want to try and talk about us as supply chain leaders in business. I think I said earlier on, we may not be leaders right now, and I don't mean senior executives, I'm talking about leaders of teams, but we will definitely be leaders of teams, either now or in the future. And I met up with Agentis, late summer last year, and I spoke to Bronwyn Hayne, and she said, well, with your views and everything, would you be able to do an article with Sam White? And so me and Sam sat down and we talked about some of the characteristics at that time that were going to be really important. And then I reached out to Sam in March and said, hey, things are starting to change here. You know, things I said and thought were pretty constant are now being seriously disrupted. Can we just revisit this one again? And there were a number of things that came out from that in terms of some of the qualities and attributes we need to have, own, engage with as part of our toolkit, how we manage, how we lead through the future. Because fundamentally, there is a saying that says that when people say, well, the only inevitable thing that, besides death and taxes is change. I've always said, no, change isn't inevitable. Change is accelerating. If you say the only inevitable thing is change is accelerating, I get that, but not just change. Change sounds like it's almost pedestrian in its pace. And regardless of where we've experienced change and how fast we think it has got to, in the future, it's going to get a lot faster. Things are going to happen quicker, and we're never going to be as slow as we are now in the future. If we believe that as a fact, we need to equip ourselves to be able to deal with that and have a skill set which is going to shine. One of those aspects is transformational leadership skills. And of course, people say transformational change and digital transformation, and let's do some transformational leadership. It all sounds really nice and easy. Transformational leadership skills is the ability to conceive a vision, is to be able to articulate that vision, and to be able to encourage people, engage with people on that vision, to encourage them to also experiment to see what that might look like, and to kind of reinform as people in your team and in the wider context of the business, experiment in trying to get that vision into place in some shape, that it reinforces that vision. And through that learning, the vision becomes more real, more doable. And then the final piece of transformational leadership is to actually embed it into the culture. This is how we do things. This is what we're about. This is how, you sometimes hear things like, it's in our DNA. Well, hold the bus. It's only when you've got a clear vision and everybody's aligned to that, is it in your DNA? The second quality here is having a project mindset. And to an extent, because I'm sure there's a few PMPs on the call, you might hear like project management mindset, and sometimes a project management approach is correct. Having the work breakdown schedules, a project management plan, and all the reports and KPIs, as if you're doing a proper formal project with a set of goals and objectives. But sometimes a project can be much more minor than that, and it doesn't need the formal approach. So I say that if we can deal with things with a project mindset, so we make sure we understand what it is that we're being asked to do, we resource it properly, we complete it, we hand it over to somebody in steady state role, we train them properly, we do the full knowledge transfer, they own it, then we can move on, we can get the next project done. And if we have this kind of constant cycling of new initiatives, bring it down, get it delivered, move on, I think that we can make a lot of progress. At my last gig, the team there were talking in years to do things which, certainly back where I came from, weeks and months, get it done in 6 months, not 6 years. So I noticed quite quickly there was a different pace. We need to speed up, but we speed up by adopting a much more structured project mindset. So we focus into a task and don't spread ourselves too widely over a whole range of things and not get anything done. So we need to, it's all about delivery, I think I'm saying here. The third thing is to be okay with VUCA, which is it's almost as rude as FUD, which was fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's now changed to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Volatility, if you're watching me on the screen, is, for instance, if we look at demand behavior, we might see an oscillation, and that oscillation might get big and small, and the volatility is a measure of the dispersion, the amplitude, as well as the frequency of which this happens. And we're going to be facing lots of volatility in our world. If we think the last 3 or 4 months have been tough, you wait until the next 6 months when we're trying to plan peak, but the peak is going to be very different to what we've experienced for the last 5-10 years. Uncertainty is the inability to forecast the future with any degree of confidence. And we've got to be able to work within that environment, but we don't know the answers. And complexity, if we think about like a living being, of which like a business pretty much is, there's loads of inputs, outputs, interactions, dependencies, dynamics, political dynamics sometimes. These are very complex systems, and we don't solve complexity. We solve complicated by simplifying, but when it comes to complexity, we need to really get a great understanding of the big picture, how it all fits together, so we can actually start to manage it. And ambiguity, things which were certain only a year or two ago, have become quite ambiguous in terms of where's the edges of things. It used to be black and white, now it's kind of weird thing in the middle, and it's unclear. So we need to be okay with that. And the thing I've got on is the emotional intelligence. If we're not able to demonstrate emotional intelligence, we will not be moving up the career ladder. So emotional intelligence is the ability to understand our own feelings and moderate those, and importantly, understand the feelings of other people and able to moderate that. So in a situation that, say, if you're in a meeting and somebody's having a good go at you, you kind of say, hang on, he's having a go at me, but it's okay. I wonder what's troubling him or her, and sort of just asking the question. You seem to be a bit agitated about this thing. Is there something we can talk about this maybe offline or now or whatever it is, and just being able to take the sting out of discussions and be able to handle that effectively. It's important to become independent if you're not already independently minded. So I had a very interesting meeting with somebody who leads the supply chain of one of our Canadian retailers, and he was recounting a story about how Amazon had done his business in, and I thought, that's not your thoughts. You've been told these thoughts and you've learnt them and you've incorporated them. You haven't done any external research yet, probably not had any time to network to get a different view on this. And it's really important to be, as you certainly go up the career ladder, to maintain your independent mindset, but also to recognize that as your business moves forward, you may have to let go of certain behaviors and thought patterns that served you well in the past as you embrace the future. So I'm saying keep your independence, but also be mindful of being able to move your mindset in terms of the future. And the most important thing here is being authentic and ensuring that you're having sufficient communication with your team and peers and often upwards. Authenticity in this context is, often people say be yourself, and of course sometimes being yourself isn't exactly what's required here, but it's being truthful and being kind of mindful of other people and what they need, and appealing to that. And sometimes we have to be very technical, very rational about a situation we're facing. Sometimes we can sort of hang out in, how do we feel about this, guys? Are we feeling good about this? Do we think we're going to win here, or do we feel we're slaughtered already? And just kind of really relating to people. I think if we can capture these 5 key traits, we stand a good opportunity of really advancing ourselves in the business as supply chain technical people, but importantly as leaders in that function. I've kind of come to the end, but I wanted just to pick one last word which is driving me insane, and it's the third point here, is when we think about pivoting. And I know I'm pretty close to time now, and I'm sorry for not being able to answer too many questions. Maybe we can have a third session. Miriam, pivot. If I hear pivot again, I'm going to probably shoot myself in the head. Pivot doesn't solve transformational change. It means that we've been able to say, if we're in manufacture, just change from this to this broad spectrum scope and change to this. So for instance, Canada Goose went from sewing up, making very expensive luxury clothing items to protect itself from very extreme cold weather, to making PPE. Brilliant job, fantastic. Did they have to do a transformational change to do that? What happens when their outlets become open again? PPE done, retool, right, get going again. So pivot is like often we say pivot, adapt, whatever it might be, but we mustn't fool ourselves believing we've done some kind of big major change. Often it's a small tweak, but while we're occupying ourselves with these pivots and small adaptations, are we actually missing a chance to have a major rethink of our overall supply chain design? So I've got 2 minutes to go, so I don't know if I ought to just finish there. And thank you all for engagement. I'm really sorry I'm not being able to pick up all the questions that you've asked. I'm just scanning through them quickly now. So William asked, do we really have to be worried about somebody being upset and emotional about the issue you're discussing? Not worried. but just recognizing. I think that's a difference, that, you know, we don't go around going, oh, I think he's getting a bit sort of agitated about me, or you know, this is not about what do they think about me or feel about me, which is probably the word, you know, the way that you're probably trying to express that concept. It's like, I'm recognizing that something, you're going through something, and I need to understand what that is, so we can actually get back to communicating, as opposed to having this sort of mismatch of emotions. Experience seems to be an online model, both scheduled potentially on the same truck. Barry made a point where if somebody wants to have speeded up service, and you've already got a truck going to them, perhaps the advantage is they can have it. But I think that requires a very high level of maturity of how the e-commerce delivery fulfillment platform is developed. So that's 1 o'clock, guys. Miriam, can I hand back to you?
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation, Gary. I really appreciate the time you took to make 2 presentations. I will be sending the recording link this afternoon, and I wish you all a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. I hope the information has been valuable for you and your team. You can connect with me via the website retail.ca and go to the contact page, or via LinkedIn by typing linkedin.com/in/last-mile. Look forward to hearing from you and playing an active part with your supply chain and your business's transformation as you start to act boldly, think big, scale, adapt, and win.